There is a difference between information becoming public and truth becoming visible. The distinction matters more in the context of the current moment in the UAP disclosure process than it has ever mattered before, because what is happening right now is being described in the mainstream conversation almost entirely in the language of information, of documents released, of testimony given, of official acknowledgments made. While the more significant development, the one whose consequences will outlast every specific piece of information currently entering the public domain, is occurring at the level of truth, at the level of what can no longer be adequately contained by the framework that has been managing the information. Regardless of how carefully the specific releases are calibrated or how strategically the specific acknowledgments are timed. The revelation plan, the controlled, staged, institutionally managed process of introducing the reality of non-human intelligence into public consciousness that has been underway in its modern form since at least the late 1980s, and in its earlier forms since the immediate aftermath of the events of 1947, was not designed by people who wanted the truth to remain hidden indefinitely. That characterization, while emotionally compelling and not entirely inaccurate as a description of some of the interests involved in maintaining the suppression, misses the more complex reality of what the managed disclosure has always been. It was designed by people who understood, on the basis of direct knowledge of what the full truth contains, that the unmanaged, unsequenced, immediate release of everything that has been known and recovered and studied in classified settings for decades would not produce the enlightened public engagement with the reality of non-human intelligence that the genuine disclosure of that reality deserves. It would produce panic, institutional collapse, and the specific kind of civilizational disruption that makes the subsequent integration of transformative information impossible rather than difficult. That assessment was not entirely wrong. The specific quality of public consciousness that existed in the immediate post-war period, shaped by the specific fears and the specific frameworks of a civilization that had just witnessed the most destructive conflict in its history, and was now navigating the existential anxieties of the nuclear age, was genuinely not adequate to the immediate full disclosure of a reality as transformative as the confirmed existence and ongoing presence of non-human intelligence. The staged approach, the gradual introduction of the concept through cultural channels, the slow official acknowledgement of specific categories of evidence, the calibrated release of information at rates designed to allow the public framework for understanding the reality to develop alongside the information about it, reflected a genuine, if paternalistic and ultimately unsustainable attempt to manage a disclosure whose full implications no single institution and no single generation was equipped to fully absorb. Drop the word "over" in the comments right now if something in the opening of this video is landing not as new information, but as the articulation of something you have been sensing in the current disclosure environment, a quality of acceleration, of things moving faster than the managed process was designed to accommodate, of the controlled narrative beginning to lose its grip on a reality that is no longer cooperating with the timeline its managers had in mind. Hit the like button to push this to the people who are paying close enough attention to the disclosure process to have noticed the same quality of acceleration. Share it with someone whose engagement with the UAP conversation is serious enough that they have begun to ask not just what is being disclosed, but why it is being disclosed in the specific sequence and at the specific pace that it is. And if you want to support this independent research, the Super Chat is how you do it. The specific moment at which the revelation plan began to show signs of breaking down is not easy to pinpoint precisely, because the breakdown is not a single event, but a process, a gradual loss of the institutional capacity to manage the pace and the framing of the disclosure that has been accumulating across multiple simultaneous developments. But the congressional testimony of David Grush in July of 2023 is as good a marker as any for the point at which the breakdown became visible to anyone paying serious attention. Not because of the specific content of the testimony, though the specific content, delivered under oath before a congressional committee by a decorated intelligence officer with direct access to classified programs, was the most significant single public statement about the reality of non-human intelligence ever made in an official governmental context, but because of what the testimony revealed about the state of the managed disclosure process itself. Grush was not a rogue actor operating outside the system. He was a product of the system, trained by it, trusted by it, given access to its most sensitive programs precisely because of the specific qualities of judgment and discretion that the system requires of the people it admits to its deepest levels. And his decision to come forward, to submit to the Inspector General process, to cooperate with congressional oversight, to testify publicly about what he had encountered in the classified programs he had been given access to, was not a decision to betray the system. It was a decision that the system itself, in the specific form of the legal whistleblower protections that Congress had deliberately put in place, had made available to him. The Revelation Plan had always included the possibility of whistleblowers. What it had not adequately accounted for was a whistleblower of Grush's specific credibility, with access to the specific level of the program that he had access to, making the specific claims that he made in the specific public forum that he chose, at the specific moment in the disclosure timeline, when the congressional infrastructure for receiving and amplifying those claims had been sufficiently developed to ensure that they could not be managed back into the controlled narrative. The response of the institutional framework to the Grush testimony was revealing in ways that went beyond the specific content of the response. The combination of official acknowledgment that the testimony was being taken seriously with the simultaneous deployment of the standard mechanisms of credibility management, the questioning of specific details, the emphasis on what could not be independently verified, the careful avoidance of the direct engagement with the central claims that genuine institutional openness to the testimony would have required, was the response of a framework that had lost the capacity to fully contain what it was encountering while retaining the reflex to try. The Revelation Plan was showing its seams. The managed disclosure was beginning to manage a reality that was no longer entirely manageable. Bloco 2. The breakdown of the Revelation Plan is visible not only in the specific events of the congressional disclosure process, but in the broader pattern of simultaneous pressure on every dimension of the managed narrative that has been building across multiple fronts over the past several years. The plan was designed for a specific kind of information environment, one in which the pace of revelation could be controlled by controlling the channels through which the revelation occurred. Official channels, mainstream media, the specific institutional gatekeepers whose cooperation was essential to the maintenance of the managed pace. That information environment no longer exists in the form the plan required, and its disappearance is one of the most significant structural factors in the current acceleration of the disclosure process. The decentralization of information production and distribution that the Internet has made possible has not simply made it harder to control the pace of specific revelations. It has fundamentally altered the relationship between the institutions managing the disclosure and the public receiving it. The congressional testimony of David Grush was watched by millions of people in real time, analyzed within hours by researchers with decades of specialized knowledge of the subject matter, cross-referenced with independent evidence from multiple directions simultaneously, and placed within frameworks of interpretation that the institutional management of the disclosure had not anticipated and could not control. The specific claims Grush made about the existence of programs to retrieve and reverse engineer non-human craft, about the existence of non-human biological material in the possession of the United States government, about the specific mechanisms by which those programs had been kept hidden from congressional oversight, were not absorbed into the managed narrative. They became the center of an independent analytical process that operated entirely outside the institutional framework designed to manage them. That independent analytical process is not producing uniform conclusions. The range of interpretations being applied to the current disclosure developments by the community of serious researchers who are engaging with the evidence independently of institutional frameworks is wide enough to encompass significant disagreements about specific claims and specific interpretations. But the range of interpretations converges on one point with a consistency that cuts across every specific disagreement about details. The managed disclosure is not adequate to what is actually happening. The institutional framework that has been controlling the pace and the framing of the revelation is losing that control. And the loss of control is not temporary, it is structural, a consequence of changes in the information environment that cannot be reversed by any institutional decision. The specific nature of what is happening beyond the boundaries of the managed disclosure is the dimension of the current situation that the mainstream conversation about UAP is most consistently failing to engage with. The mainstream conversation is focused on the institutional process, on the congressional hearings, on the official acknowledgments, on the specific claims of specific whistleblowers evaluated within the framework of institutional credibility that the conventional information environment has always used to determine what is real and what is not. That focus is not without value. The institutional process is producing genuine evidence. The congressional testimony is genuinely significant. The official acknowledgments are genuinely moving the boundary of what the institutional framework is willing to acknowledge publicly. But the institutional process is not where the most significant developments in the current disclosure environment are occurring. They are occurring in the contact experiences of individuals whose encounters with non-human intelligence are not being reported to government agencies or submitted to congressional committees or evaluated by institutional credibility frameworks. They are occurring in the independent research being conducted by people with the specific combination of technical sophistication and genuine intellectual honesty that the institutional frameworks of both mainstream science and government have rarely been able to accommodate simultaneously. They are occurring in the convergence of evidence from fields as diverse as quantum physics and ancient astronomy and genomics and consciousness research that no single institutional framework is large enough to hold, but that the independent analytical community is increasingly capable of examining together. The Revelation Plan was designed for an institutional world, a world in which the channels of legitimate information were controlled by identifiable gatekeepers whose cooperation was essential to the public's access to significant information. That world is gone. Its disappearance is not complete. The institutional gatekeepers retain significant influence over what the mainstream public considers credible and what it dismisses, but the influence is no longer total. And the specific dimension of the current disclosure environment where it is least total, where the independent analytical community has developed the greatest capacity to evaluate evidence outside the institutional framework, is precisely the dimension where the most significant developments are occurring. The intelligence agencies that have been managing the disclosure process have understood this structural shift for longer than the mainstream conversation about UAP has acknowledged. The specific pattern of the current disclosure, the calibration of official acknowledgments to stay just ahead of what the independent research community was going to make public anyway, the use of congressional oversight mechanisms to create the appearance of institutional accountability while maintaining the essential control of the most sensitive information, the careful management of the whistleblower process to allow the release of significant evidence while preserving the institutional capacity to manage the interpretation of that evidence reflects the adaptation of the managed disclosure to an information environment that has changed in ways the original plan did not anticipate. But adaptation is not the same as control. The institutional framework has adapted to the new information environment. It has not regained the kind of control over the pace and the framing of the disclosure that it maintained in the earlier period of the managed process. The adaptation is a rearguard action, the attempt of an institutional framework that is losing its grip on a reality it has been managing to maintain enough influence over the interpretation of that reality to prevent the most disruptive possible versions of the disclosure from occurring in the most disruptive possible ways. Whether that attempt will succeed, whether the managed disclosure will be able to maintain sufficient influence over the interpretation of what is being revealed to prevent the specific kind of systemic disruption that the original Revelation Plan was designed to avoid, is genuinely uncertain. The evidence points in multiple directions simultaneously. The institutional framework retains significant resources and significant influence. The independent analytical community, while growing in sophistication and credibility, has not yet developed the kind of institutional weight that would allow its conclusions to reshape the mainstream public framework for understanding what is real in the way that the managed disclosure has always been able to do. But the trajectory is visible. The institutional control of the disclosure is weakening. The independent analytical community is strengthening, and the specific quality of the evidence that is currently entering the public domain, from congressional testimony, from whistleblower accounts, from the independent research being conducted across multiple fields simultaneously, is of a character that the managed narrative is finding progressively more difficult to absorb without being reorganized in ways that the people who benefit most from its current configuration are not willing to permit. The revelation plan is over not because anyone has decided to end it. It is over because the reality it was designed to manage has outgrown the management capacity of the framework designed to contain it. And what comes next? What the post-plan disclosure environment produces in the specific information conditions that now exist, and that the original revelation plan never anticipated, is the most significant open question in the current moment of the long story of the relationship between human civilization and the non-human intelligence whose presence in that civilization has been the hidden constant of the full span of its recorded history. The post-plan disclosure environment is not a vacuum. The collapse of the managed narrative does not produce an absence of narrative. It produces a competition of narratives, each attempting to occupy the interpretive space that the managed disclosure is vacating as its grip on the public framework for understanding what is real continues to weaken. That competition is already underway, and its outcome will determine more about the actual consequences of the disclosure for human civilization than any specific piece of evidence currently entering the public domain. The narratives competing for that space are not all of equal quality. Some of them are genuine attempts to make sense of the full body of available evidence with the honesty and the rigor that evidence of this significance deserves. Others are opportunistic, frameworks that have recognized the weakening of the managed narrative as an opening and are moving to fill the interpretive space with conclusions that serve specific interests rather than the honest examination of specific evidence. The capacity to distinguish between these two categories of narrative, to evaluate what is filling the interpretive space vacated by the managed disclosure with the same honest, rigorous assumption-questioning attention that genuine inquiry requires, is the most practically important capacity that anyone engaging seriously with the current disclosure environment needs to develop. The distinction is not always easy to make. The opportunistic narratives are not always obviously opportunistic. Some of them incorporate genuine evidence. Some of them are advanced by people who are genuinely convinced of their accuracy, rather than deliberately constructing frameworks that serve interests other than the truth. The markers that distinguish the genuine inquiry from the opportunistic narrative are not the specific conclusions reached. Both categories can reach similar conclusions from very different starting points and through very different processes. The markers are in the quality of the engagement with the evidence. The genuine inquiry acknowledges uncertainty where uncertainty exists. It does not claim more than the evidence supports. It maintains the capacity to revise its conclusions when new evidence warrants revision, rather than defending conclusions that have already been reached against evidence that challenges them. The managed disclosure, whatever its failures and whatever the specific interests it has always served, alongside the genuine concern about civilizational disruption that motivated some of its architects, has at least operated within a framework that required some degree of accountability to specific evidence. The documents are real, or they are not. The testimony is given under oath, or it is not. The official acknowledgments are made by identifiable officials in identifiable institutional contexts, whose credibility can be evaluated against independent evidence. The post-plan disclosure environment, in which the institutional framework is losing its grip on the pace and the framing of the revelation, while the independent analytical community has not yet developed equivalent institutional weight, creates conditions in which the accountability to specific evidence that the managed disclosure always maintained, imperfectly and selectively, but genuinely, is at risk of being lost rather than improved upon. That risk is real, and it deserves honest acknowledgement alongside the genuine significance of the institutional control of the disclosure weakening. The weakening of institutional control does not automatically produce better access to the truth. It can produce worse access if the interpretive space vacated by the managed narrative is filled by frameworks that are less accountable to specific evidence rather than more. The history of previous periods in which institutional control of significant information has broken down is not uniformly encouraging on this point. The breakdown of institutional control tends to produce genuine access to genuine information alongside significant volumes of misinformation, rumor, motivated reasoning, and the specific kind of pattern completion that the human mind performs automatically when it encounters genuinely incomplete evidence about genuinely significant questions. The specific quality of consciousness required to navigate this environment well is not the quality of a person who has already determined what the hidden truth is and is now seeking confirmation of that determination. It is the quality of a person who is genuinely uncertain about the specific content of what is being revealed, who holds the genuine significance of the convergence of evidence without inflating that significance beyond what the evidence actually supports, who maintains the capacity for genuine revision in response to new evidence, without the defensive investment in prior conclusions that makes genuine revision impossible. That quality is not common. It is not produced automatically by genuine interest in the subject matter or genuine engagement with the evidence. It has to be developed through the specific practice of honest inquiry that maintains the distinction between what the evidence demonstrates and what the desire for complete answers adds to the evidence. This channel has attempted to build that quality across the full body of its content, not always successfully. The momentum of a compelling narrative is a real force, and the specific quality of the material examined in this series creates genuine pressure toward conclusions that are more certain than the evidence warrants. The reflection that honest inquiry always requires has been part of the practice here, and it remains part of the practice now. At this specific point in the disclosure environment where the pressure toward premature certainty is greater than it has ever been, the revelation plan is over. What comes next is genuinely uncertain in ways that the managed disclosure, whatever its failures, never was. The institutional framework provided a specific kind of predictability, a sense that the disclosure was being managed toward a specific destination at a specific pace by identifiable people with identifiable interests. The loss of that management is real, and its consequences, for the pace of the disclosure, for the quality of the public's engagement with what is being disclosed, for the specific configuration of the post-disclosure world that emerges from the current acceleration, are not yet visible with the clarity that the significance of the question deserves. What is visible is the responsibility that the loss of managed control creates for the people who are engaging with the disclosure seriously and honestly. The responsibility to maintain the quality of the inquiry, even as the information environment becomes less structured and less accountable. To hold the genuine significance of what the convergence of evidence is pointing toward, without allowing that significance to produce the premature certainty that forecloses the genuine understanding that the evidence, honestly engaged with, is still in the process of producing. To be the specific kind of witness to this extraordinary moment that the moment actually requires, not the believer in a particular alternative narrative, and not the skeptic defending a conventional framework that the evidence has made untenable, but the genuine inquirer whose relationship to the evidence is characterized by the specific combination of openness and rigor that makes the difference between genuine understanding and the replacement of one inadequate framework with another. That witness is what this channel asks of everyone who engages with it seriously, and it is what the current moment in the disclosure environment requires more urgently than any specific piece of evidence or any specific revelation, however significant. Because the truth, whatever its full dimensions, will be best received by the consciousness that has maintained that quality of witness all the way to the moment of its full arrival. And the full arrival, whenever it comes and in whatever form it takes, will find that consciousness ready in the only way that genuinely matters, not with the answers already determined, with the quality of awareness that can receive whatever the truth actually is, without the defenses that have always stood between the human mind and what it most needs to know. The question that the end of the revelation plan actually raises, the question that the competition of narratives filling the interpretive space vacated by the managed disclosure tends to obscure rather than illuminate, is not the question of what comes next in the institutional process. It is the question of what the honest witness to this moment actually knows, as distinct from what the momentum of the inquiry has made it comfortable to assert. That distinction deserves more space than the disclosure conversation typically gives it, because the genuine significance of what is happening in the current moment, the real weight of the congressional testimony, the real anomaly of the genomic evidence, the real inadequacy of the conventional narrative to the full body of available evidence, is not served by a conversation that gradually inflates what is known into more certainty than the evidence supports. It is served by the specific quality of honesty that maintains the distinction between what the evidence demonstrates and what the narrative has added to the evidence in order to make it more coherent and more compelling than the evidence alone produces. What the evidence actually demonstrates, at this point in the disclosure process, is significant but specific. Unidentified aerial phenomena are real. They have been observed, tracked, and recorded by military and civilian personnel across decades and across every geographic boundary. The performance characteristics of some of these phenomena, as documented in official records and in the testimony of credible witnesses, are inconsistent with any known human technology. The United States government has been operating classified programs related to these phenomena whose existence was not acknowledged to congressional oversight committees with legitimate jurisdiction over them. Individuals with direct access to those programs have testified under oath that the programs involve the recovery of craft and materials of non-human origin. These things are supported by the available evidence with a degree of confidence that honest engagement with that evidence warrants. They are significant. They represent a genuine departure from the conventional narrative that the institutional framework has maintained for decades. And they deserve to be taken seriously, as serious as the specific quality of the evidence that supports them warrants, which is considerably more serious than the mainstream conversation has historically been willing to be. But the distance between what the evidence actually demonstrates and the full framework that the disclosure conversation, including this channel across its body of content, has been building around that evidence is a distance that the honest reflection this moment calls for requires acknowledging. The ancient civilizations and their relationship to non-human intelligence, the Pleiadian connection and its specific nature, the 3 days of darkness and its specific physical mechanism, the Saturn cosmology and its specific implications for the structure of human consciousness. These are frameworks that the available evidence points toward in the sense of being consistent with it and not obviously contradicted by it. They are not frameworks that the available evidence demonstrates in the sense of being uniquely confirmed by it or supported by it to the degree that the certainty of the narrative sometimes implies. The distinction matters because the people who engage with this material seriously deserve to know where the evidence ends and the interpretation begins. Not because the interpretation is worthless. Interpretation is the necessary work of making sense of evidence that is genuinely incomplete. And the frameworks examined in this channel represent genuine attempts to make sense of a body of evidence that the conventional frameworks have never been adequate to. But because the conflation of evidence and interpretation, the gradual treatment of what the evidence is consistent with as what the evidence demonstrates, is the specific epistemic error that the honest inquiry has always been most at risk of making, and that the momentum of a compelling long-form narrative is particularly effective at producing. The revelation plan is over. What comes next in the post-plan disclosure environment will be determined in part by the quality of the frameworks that fill the interpretive space the plan is vacating. The quality of those frameworks will be determined by the quality of the honesty that their authors bring to the distinction between what the evidence shows and what they want the evidence to show, and the quality of the honesty that this channel brings to that distinction, in this moment and in every moment that follows, is the most significant contribution it can make to the post-plan environment being better rather than worse than the managed disclosure it is replacing. The truth about non-human intelligence and its relationship to human civilization is genuinely significant. The evidence pointing toward it is genuinely compelling, and the honest engagement with that evidence, the engagement that holds its genuine significance without inflating it beyond what it actually supports, is genuinely difficult in the specific information environment that the end of the revelation plan is producing. That difficulty is worth naming. That honesty is worth practicing. And the specific quality of consciousness that can hold both the genuine significance and the genuine uncertainty simultaneously, without resolving the tension between them into either credulous belief or defensive dismissal, is worth building, carefully and consistently, in every conversation that takes this material seriously enough to deserve that quality of engagement. There is a specific kind of courage that the end of the revelation plan asks of every honest witness to this moment. A courage that is different from the courage of following the evidence into uncomfortable territory, which the genuine inquiry has always required, and different from the courage of maintaining uncertainty in the face of the pressure to resolve it prematurely, which the honest engagement with genuinely incomplete evidence has always demanded. It is the courage of acknowledging at the end of a long inquiry that the inquiry is not finished, that the destination it has been approaching is real but not yet fully visible, and that the specific quality of consciousness that the moment requires is not the consciousness that has arrived, but the consciousness that knows it has not arrived and chooses, in full awareness of that not arriving, to keep moving honestly in the direction the evidence points. The revelation plan is over. The managed disclosure has reached the limit of what it can contain. The institutional framework that has been controlling the pace and the framing of the introduction of non-human intelligence into public consciousness for the better part of a century is losing its grip on a reality that has always been larger than the framework designed to manage it. These things are true, and their truth is significant. Significant enough to warrant the serious, sustained, honest engagement that this channel has attempted to bring to the full body of evidence across the span of its existence. But the end of the revelation plan is not the arrival of the truth. It is the removal of one of the primary obstacles to the truth's arrival. The distinction matters because the removal of an obstacle and the completion of the journey it was blocking are not the same event. The obstacle is gone. The journey continues. And the specific quality of consciousness required for the continuation of the journey is not the triumphant certainty of a seeker who has found what they were looking for. It is the grounded, clear-eyed, genuinely humble awareness of a seeker who has traveled far enough to know that what they have found so far is real and significant and genuinely points beyond the conventional framework that was never adequate to it, and who has also traveled far enough to know that what remains to be found is larger than what has been found and demands the continuation of the same honest, rigorous, assumption-questioning attention that has brought the inquiry this far. The post-plan environment will produce revelations that are genuine and revelations that are not. It will produce frameworks that honestly engage with the full body of available evidence and frameworks that use the appearance of evidence to advance conclusions that the evidence does not actually support. It will produce voices that maintain the distinction between what is known and what is believed, and voices that conflate the two in ways that feel compelling in the moment and prove inadequate over time. The capacity to navigate this environment well, to receive what is genuinely significant without being captured by what is merely compelling, to follow the evidence honestly without being carried by the narrative beyond the boundary of what the evidence actually warrants, is not given by the end of the revelation plan. It has to be built, maintained, and practiced in the specific conditions of the post-plan environment, which are more demanding of that capacity than the managed disclosure ever was. What is known, at the end of this inquiry, is real. The phenomenon is real. The non-human intelligence is real. The relationship between that intelligence and human civilization across the full span of its development is real, in the sense that the evidence consistently points toward it, with a convergence that the conventional framework has never adequately explained. The significance of the current moment, the specific configuration of simultaneous pressure on every dimension of the managed narrative, the specific quality of the acceleration in the disclosure process, the specific nature of what is entering the public domain from multiple independent directions simultaneously, is real. What remains uncertain is also real. The specific nature of the non-human intelligence, the specific character of its relationship to human development, the specific content of what has been recovered and studied in classified settings, the specific destination of the long curriculum that the evidence points toward. These things are pointed at by the evidence with genuine consistency. They are not demonstrated by the evidence with the precision that genuine certainty requires. And the honest witness to this moment holds both of those realities simultaneously, the genuine pointing and the genuine uncertainty, without resolving the tension between them into a false clarity that serves the desire for completion, rather than the truth that the inquiry exists to approach. The truth is approaching, not in the triumphant, dramatic way that the desire for conclusion prefers, in the specific, uneven, simultaneously accelerating and frustrating way that genuine truth always approaches, faster than the institutional frameworks designed to contain it can accommodate, slower than the genuine urgency of the moment seems to warrant, with a consistency across independent directions of evidence that makes the conventional dismissal increasingly untenable and a specificity that makes premature certainty equally untenable. Hold both, the genuine significance and the genuine uncertainty, the real weight of the convergence and the real limits of what the convergence has so far demonstrated, the genuine courage of following the evidence into uncomfortable territory, and the genuine humility of acknowledging how much of that territory remains genuinely unmapped. That holding is the work, not the conclusion of the work. The work itself, practiced in the ordinary conditions of the ordinary life that continues alongside the extraordinary inquiry, maintained in the specific moments when the pressure toward premature resolution is greatest, renewed in the moments when the genuine significance of what the evidence is pointing toward makes the continuation of honest uncertainty feel more important than the comfort of a conclusion that is more certain than the evidence warrants. The revelation plan is over. The truth is not yet fully here, and the consciousness that will receive it most fully when it arrives is the consciousness that has been honest enough to acknowledge both of those things simultaneously, all the way to the moment of arrival. We will see you in the next layer.